So the trusty Leman Russ tank or the new and shiny Rogal Dorn? From what we know so far, which one is shaping up to be the better tank in the new Guard Codex? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a quick comparison of the stat lines and leaked rules that we know of the new Rogal Dorn and the new profile for the Leman Russ battle tank. With the coming of a new big guard tank on the horizon, I think a fair few people were thinking about whether or not it will be treading on the toes of the Ross, and I think quite a few people are hoping that they'll manage to make both of them viable and not just have one of them as the clear best solution. Obviously, it's fairly early days yet. The information that we know about the stat lines is purely from leaked rules, and a lot of the time there might be certain differences between the stat lines that get leaked out from early playtest versions and the ones that eventually materialise. Still though, I thought it would be interesting to run some numbers and see which tanks are looking strongest right now, at least based on what we know so far. Let's take a look at the stat line of both tanks quickly, and then compare some of their damage and durability. As with the rest of the leaked rules from this codex, these all come from the leaks from Morty and Glory and their leaked copy of the playtester codex. Thoroughly recommend checking out his channel, plenty more great guard content, and it's a great guard resource to follow, particularly when there's a new codex coming out. I'll link his channel down in the video description. Moving on to the leaks profiles though, here's what we know about the Rogal Dorn so far. The full leaks profile from the playtester copy. Obviously there's the possibility that some guns or some points might change somewhat. Currently though, the rumoured numbers are 250 points for the tank at base, and as you'd expect for that, a pretty chunky stat line, a 10-inch move and hitting on 4s, strength 8 and a big toughness 9, 17 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 8 and a 2+ save. As with the Ross and several other tanks in the Guard Codex, it appears that it also gets the turret weapon rule, a +1 ballistic skill on the big guns, and also the ability to fire out of combat. On the turret weapon, there's the choice between a twin battle cannon and an oppressor cannon. I must admit I am a bit suspect of the twin battle cannon's profile. It's 2d6 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 according to the leaks, but that just doesn't really fit very well with the battle cannon stat line from the Leman Russ, which sounds very plausible. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3. I genuinely would have expected the twin battle cannon to just literally be twice that, maybe 2d6 plus 6. Just having it as 2d6 but a bit of extra AP seems really weird. You're not really getting any more shots than a standard battle cannon. The only thing that's really improving is an extra bit of AP. The one for the oppressor cannon though, that looks a lot more believable. 90-inch range and heavy d6 plus 3 shots, strength 10, AP 3 and damage 4. A really big chunky anti-tank weapon there. That one also comes with a coaxial autocannon as well, also a turret weapon apparently. Otherwise, on its hull, there's also a pulverizer cannon, basically a battle cannon but only 24-inch range and d6 shots, and a castigator Gatling cannon, 12 shots at strength 5, AP-1 and damage 1. I feel like those two hull-mounted profiles are fairly equivalent to be honest, depends on what target you want to be going after. Otherwise, it's got the options of a couple of sponsons and a couple of front-mounted stubbers or melter guns as well. Those ones are 5 points each. If we compare that to the Leman Russ though now, that's 140 points, but effectively 150 due to having to pay 10 points for either a las cannon or a heavy bolter, as it has to take one of those on the hull. The stat line's fairly similar to the current one, it just gains +1 wound, loses grinding advance, but gains a lot of turret weapon buffs as you can see here, and the same turret weapon rule for the 3+ ballistic skill and fire out of melee. These are the profiles for all the different turret guns. The battle cannon gets an average of 6 or 7 shots at a big damage 3. The demolisher cannon now gets far fewer shots, just d6, but it gets a big damage d3 plus 3 when you shoot them. The Punisher Gatling cannon's got 20 shots at strength 6 AP-1, good for hordes. The Eradicator Nova cannon, d3 plus 6, strength 6 AP2 and damage 2. That one's got decently more shots, but basically worse strength and not great AP. The Executioner Plasma Cannon is d6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP-4 and damage 3. Ones do a mortal wound if you overcharge, though you can keep it at strength 7 and damage 2 if you don't need to. The Exterminator Autocannon is 6 shots at strength 8, AP-2 and damage 2, and looks basically inferior to the Battle Cannon there. And finally the Vanquisher Cannon has a single massive shot at strength 14, AP4 and a huge damage d3 plus 6. It ignores invuls and gives you d3 mortal wounds as well, so usually if you convert one hit, that's typically going to be an average of 10 wounds per single shot. Out of these, my instincts from a first glance were that the most interesting ones were the Battle Cannon, Executioner Plasma Cannon, the Demolisher and the Vanquisher, and I thought it might be interesting to see how they stack up against a few targets if we are going to be comparing to the Rogal Dorn. Here's just a few numbers for how the various Ross weapons do against a bunch of different targets. As you might expect, the Punisher comes out trumps against any light infantry with 1 wound, over double the next best option, which is the Eradicator Nova Cannon, which it itself isn't really that much more impressive than the Battle Cannon or the Executioner. Against elite infantry, maybe it's not too much surprise that the Executioner wins there. Great AP and a flat damage of 3 does great, and it still wins out even if you don't bother overcharging and just embrace the high AP and damage too. Otherwise, there's a fair amount of different guns that don't do too badly beyond that. The Battle Cannon, Eradicator, and Exterminator all get just under 2. The Punisher puts in a good showing, and the Demolisher is still on the radar. If you move on to against heavier targets, then the Executioner does best again. This time it does need to overcharge to keep up as well, so you will likely be paying for that damage with around about 1 mortal wound on your tank on average. Otherwise, in second place is the Demolisher Cannon on 6.5, the Standard Battle Cannon on 5.8, and then closely followed by the Vanquisher Cannon at 5.5, though admittedly the Vanquisher Cannon will have the advantage of going straight through invuls and not caring about them. Finally, against some really hard targets, say for example something like a Plague Burst Crawler with Toughness 8, a 5 plus invul, and -1 damage, the Demolisher is the winner there still, but only just, 4.1 wounds versus the Vanquisher's average turn on turn of 4, obviously delivered in great big massive gobs, and then the Battle Cannon and the Executioner drop down to 2.9. I would bear in mind as well that one of the better regimental traits is one that just gives you a single reroll to hit for every single unit in your army, and that one looks like it'd particularly get on well with the Vanquisher. It'd mean that you will be hitting most of the time, and maybe give that one a bit more of a relative buff against all the hard targets. Out of these, for a general purpose damage dealer though, I feel like it does match up with my expectations. Perhaps the Executioner against these targets looks like one of the best all-round damage dealers, though admittedly you do pay for that privilege with some mortal wounds. Otherwise, against tanks, both the Demolisher and the Vanquisher seem to have their merits, and the Battle Cannon is just pretty much all-round solid against everything, and of course has better range and the advantage over the Executioner of not taking mortal wounds on yourself. For comparing some damage against the Rogal Dorn, I thought it might make sense to go with perhaps the best anti-tank Ross versus the best anti-tank Dorn, and I thought we'd leave off sponsons here as both of them could take multi-melters if they wanted to. We'll go for a Leman Russ Demolisher with a las cannon on the Russ side, and a Rogal Dorn with a Pressor Cannon and Pulverizer on the Dorn side. I could have gone for an Executioner for the Rosses. Basically the results will be fairly similar to this, except to do a bit better against the Toughness 7 target, but a bit worse against the Toughness 8 one. Comparing a Demolisher plus las cannon to a Rogal Dorn Oppressor Cannon plus Coaxial Auto Cannon and Pulverizer though, the results actually come out surprisingly even. Against the T7 target, it's around about 7 or 8 wounds from the Ross, around about 5 wounds per 100 points, and for the Rogal Dorn it's around 12 or 13 wounds on average, also almost exactly 5 for 100 points. Against the Toughness 8 hard target, with a 5 plus invul and -1 damage, the Ross does a bit better. It does around about 3.1 wounds per 100 points, whereas the Rogal Dorn is down to 2.8. A little bit worse, but honestly there's really not much in it there. That's a pretty tiny damage differential. Overall, it honestly does look really quite balanced, at least between this pair on a damage front. The Dorn does seem to lose out slightly in terms of raw damage, but I bear in mind that the main gun does have a longer range as well. On the Ross, the las cannon's long range, but the main gun is short ranged, and on the Dorn, it's the Pulverizer cannon that's the short range 24-inch one, whereas the main gun can strike over to the other side of the battlefield basically. In general though, slightly shorter range isn't the worst thing on the world in 9th edition battlefields, which are quite terrain heavy, and perhaps a bit less so than it even mattered before as well, seeing as apparently Rosses are going to be able to move 10 inches and still shoot, unless there's any rules that we don't know about. I guess we'll have to wait and see the numbers on the twin battle cannon, but compared with some of the better anti-armor Rosses, at least in terms of numbers per turn, both units do seem to be at least on a reasonably level playing field. Otherwise, the other main thing to compare against is the base durability. Kind of an interesting one, as the Dorn has 17 wounds but the Ross has 13, though you also have to factor in that the Dorn gets Toughness 9 where the Leman Russ doesn't. It's kind of interesting that the Dorn basically is a little bit tougher at least against Strength 8 or Strength 9 weapons, but for anything else it looks like the Ross does win out a bit. If you're not being shot by Strength 8 or Strength 9, then the Dorn has 6.8 wounds per 100 points, and the Ross has 8.7 wounds per 100 points, so basically the Leman Russ is about 27% tougher against anything else that isn't those specific strengths. That is quite a solid increase, just basically having more wounds on the board for the cost. For Strength 8 weapons though, which is pretty common on anti-tank, things like Melter, Dark Lances, missile launchers and things, the Rogal Dorn essentially has an extra 50% of toughness compared with the Ross, as you're wounding it on 5s rather than wounding it on 4s. Basically, this means that the Rogal Dorn gets a plus 17% toughness over the Ross against those weapons, which is a decent advantage, but honestly perhaps not quite as much as I might have expected for wounding on 5s. For Strength 9 weapons, things like las cannons are also really quite common. The two seem to be roughly equivalent. You'd be wounding the Rogal Dorn on 4s and the Ross on 3s, not quite as big an advantage in terms of percentage wise. It winds up being a small win for the Rogal Dorn, but only 3% extra toughness, so close that it might as well not matter. Overall, it really depends on the prevalence of Strength 8 weapons in the meta. If your opponent has to try and kill your tank with something that's Strength 8, the Rogal Dorn is going to do better, but if the majority of their weapons are either Strength 9 or other strength, then it looks like you're probably better off with a Ross. They are going to be better against most circumstances and against the ever-present mortal wounds in 9th. Overall then, at least for this early take, I would say that the two seem to be really quite well balanced based on these numbers alone. The damage output against a couple of vehicles does seem at least relatively equivalent, and the durability does actually seem like a pretty reasonable trade-off. The Dawn does pay a bit of a premium for Toughness 9, but it does matter in quite a big way against Strength 8 in particular. Of course, that's probably not quite the end of it, as we really need to wait and see exactly what final synergies are present in the Guard Codex, though we do have some hints on some of the other stuff. Just in general, anything that's a single unit buff is generally going to be more efficient on a big platform like the Rogal Dorn, so things like tank ace upgrades and stratagems, presuming they cost the same on it, will generally be a bit more efficient. It does sound that apparently at least one thing will cost a bit more in that -1 damage stratagem that's rumoured. That's 2 CP on Russ's, but 3 CP on the Rogal Dorn, probably just making it a bit too expensive realistically. I would bear in mind that the bigger hull might make the Rogal Dorn harder to hide as well. The heavy tank does look like it's significantly bigger than the Leman Russ, and it might just not be able to take cover behind ruins quite as well without, say, the back of it sticking out a bit. Fortunately, though, it is just on the right side of hiding behind obscuring terrain. If it had been 18 wounds, then you would have been able to shoot it directly anyway, and that would have been a massive negative. Just from an early look at the regimental traits, I do feel that the Ross might get a little bit better from what looks like a really easy combo of reroll one single hit roll and an extra 4-inch range. They both seem like very reasonable damage buffs if you did pick up both of them, and they seem like they're pretty well made on things like a Demolisher, with a short range and very powerful shots. We still do need to see the final twin battle cannon profile as well. I feel like if it is the one described, it might be a bit on the underwhelming side. But if it does wind up being something a bit more akin to the standard Ross battle cannon but twice as much, then it could be quite an interesting option. I certainly feel like this is probably a topic that might well be better revisited after the full codex is out, but I was quite interested to see the early numbers from the information that we had so far. So anyway, let me know what you think. After the Dawn and the Ross, which of the two do you think is looking strongest at the moment, or would you say that from the information that we know they are at least reasonably well balanced? I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes, and I certainly do hope that Games Workshop managed to keep both tanks relevant. It would be a shame to see nothing but one of them and the other one being relegated to the shelves for a long time to come. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I'll certainly be hoping to release plenty more Guard content in the run-up to the Codex and some in-depth reviews once it's out. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.